Deer and elk. Deer and elk are what many of the public, especially hunters, and many wildlife biologists think of when they're looking at a patch of early xeral forests. They are icons because of their important role in the history of this country and their relationship with early xeral forests. This morning I'm going to talk a little bit about their history, their habitat use characteristics, especially in association with early xeral forests, why it's important to them, and if the attributes of early xeral forests that benefit deer and elk will also benefit other wildlife species. Early settlers here in Oregon reported abundant mule deer in this state. But by 1850s, the numbers started to decline. So much so that by 1909, the first buck hunting laws were enacted, several refuges were set up, and several areas that were closed to hunting were also established. By the 1930s, the mule deer were already beginning to overutilize a portion of their range. Their expansion in numbers was really sort of due to those hunting regulations that were put in, the closed areas, the refuges, but also in addition to predator control and the fact that overgrazing by livestock, which really depleted a lot of the native grasslands, resulted in brush shrub habitat being created, which was more beneficial in many respects to deer. By 1940s, herd control measures had to be instituted because of the damage that they were causing. Most of those controls, of course, were in the form of antlerless hunting. And then more recently, in the 1980s, we had a series of severe winters that caused a significant decline in the number of deer. And in such a cases, we actually went into winter feeding programs in some places in eastern Oregon because of it. Elk, too, were very plentiful when early settlers and explorers came to Oregon. But market hunting devastated our elk herds, so much to the point that there was only a few of them left by the turn of the century. Market hunting was made illegal in 1905. By 1908, hunting was banned for elk in the state, and a series of reintroductions began in 1911. Those elk were predominantly from Jackson, Wyoming. It wasn't until 1933 that hunting for elk was reinstated in the state. Of course, by 1938, elk damage complaints began in the Elkhorn Mountains and really in other places in eastern Oregon. But as recently as the 1970s, the Department of Fish and Wildlife had a series of transplants in western Oregon into areas where elk were not present, and the existing herds were really kind of stagnant and very localized in smaller areas. Deer and elk, they're, of course, habitat generalists. Deer are certainly more specialized than elk. Both of them reach their highest densities in early xeral forest habitats. They're not entirely dependent on early xeral forests, but they do reach high densities in them. There's also ample evidence, lots of documentation about deer and elk populations declining as early xeral forest habitats decline as well. Really good example of deer populations and how they can benefit from early xeral forest habitats was the Tillamook burn. Tillamook burn was actually a series of 3 burns, 1933, 1939, 1945, in that era. And in 1958, an enclosure was built on the Cedar Creek watershed inside the Tillamook burn. About a half a square mile was enclosed by a fence, and a really good study was conducted on black-tailed deer population dynamics and their food preferences. But the point I wanted to make was that the deer population inside that enclosure reached 109 deer per square mile. That's incredibly high, dense population of deer. After 5 years, approximately 1/3 of them died due to overbrowsing. But over the average of the 5 years, there were 62 deer per square mile. For deer and elk, really, early xeral forest habitat, and we talked about it this morning, Tom Spees talked about it this morning, really what is an early xeral forest habitat for wildlife? I suppose wildlife biologists could define early xeral forest habitat differently than foresters could. We can certainly define it differently for different species of wildlife. But for deer and elk, basically, early xeral forest habitat is primarily a source of food. It does provide some cover. It's a place to have their young. It's a place to grow their antlers. But within this habitat type, there are very important microclimates and microhabitats as well. There are also differences in the quality and quantity of food and cover for deer and elk within early xeral forests. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But for simplicity's sake, at least for this talk, I'm going to refer to early xeral forest habitat as basically post-disturbance to closed canopy with little or no forest understory or plant understory. A little bit about the deer physiology. The ratio of the volume of a deer's rumen to their body mass is relatively small. As a result, the microbial digestion of the vegetation in the rumen has less time to occur than other ruminants with a larger ratio. The end result is that deer need a high-quality diet. One is basically that is highly digestible and nutritious. The greater the cellulose content of cell walls, the greater the crude fiber, the less breakdown occurs in these cells. So deer basically forage quickly, then they go off to ruminate somewhere where they can digest their food in a matter of time. In the wintertime, their forage intake decreases. That's more or less an adaptation to energy conservation during scarce food supplies. They're less active in the winter. They burn fewer calories and so on. To survive a winter, though, they have to put on a considerable amount of fat during the summer, or during the growing season at least. And the most critical time period for deer is the beginning of the growing season. They're typically at the lowest level of their fat reserves. Their metabolism is increased. They need more food. And at this time, late winter storms that would cover forage can cause the largest die-offs. Elk, on the other hand, have a much bigger rumen to body mass ratio. What that means is that they're more similar to cattle. Because of this ratio, an elk is easily more capable of digesting plants that have a higher cellulose content. In other words, an elk can survive on less digestible diet than a deer can, as long as there's enough quantity. I've heard it commented before in other talks that an elk can eat whatever a deer can eat, plus about 50% more. Their eating pattern is similar to deer in that they eat quickly, spend a large part of their time ruminating. Because their social structure, they tend to form groups as a predator defense mechanism. They are different than deer in many respects, and they can select areas to ruminate that are quite different than deer. In fact, you often find herds of elk ruminating in an early xeral forest that actually has very little cover. Like deer, though, elk also lose weight during the winter, and their metabolic rate goes down. They burn less calories, and they, too, have to gain weight during the summer months to make it through winter. Just one little bit more about deer and elk forage. The quality of forage is more important to a deer, like I said, but important to both. The quality of forage depends upon the crude protein levels, which are typically highest during the growing season, and digestible energy is also very important. Crude fiber negatively affects digestibility, and crude fiber increases during the winter. Dry matter, on the other hand, affects the quantity of nutrients available for digestion, and dry matter is lowest during the growing season and highest during the winter. So typically, plants are more nutritious and digestible during the spring and the summer, during the growing season, if you will. But some species of plants will show little differences between seasons. All in all, plant species diversity is very important for deer. They are typically called browsers. Browsers basically eat the stems and leaves of woody vegetation. They do eat flowers or forbs, and they do consume grasses. But basically, plant species diversity is very important to a deer. I'm going to kind of differentiate between mule deer and black-tailed deer a little bit. Black-tailed deer, these are some of the food sources that were determined to be preferred foods by black-tailed deer. Most of this came out of the Cedar Creek study that I mentioned earlier. But the studies on their use and preference indicate that deer prefer green, leafy vegetation in all seasons. They will eat evergreen and semi-evergreen shrubs and leaves that retain their leaves in the winter. In the winter, though, however, if grasses are growing and they're not dormant, they can become a large part of a black-tailed deer's diet, especially just before green up really occurs for a lot of the forbs. Forbs are primarily used during the growing season, and they can be used if they maintain their leaves in the wintertime. The use of grass for black-tailed deer drops off pretty quickly once it starts to mature. Mule deer are very similar to blacktail in a sense, although from what I can tell, they will tend to eat a few more grasses and later in the growing season than black-tailed deer would. But these are just some of the lists of some of the important species to mule deer. There's, of course, their diet varies seasonally as well, too. Elk are primarily grazers. They do prefer grasses, even when both shrubs and grasses are in basically the same area at the same amount. They'll prefer grasses. Their diet, of course, can be very, very variable. However, during the spring green-up, elk really select and prefer grasses. In fact, it causes an incredible amount of problems since most of the grasses you find these days are on private property. Elk will switch over like deer do to forbs and shrubs as grasses mature, although it's quite clear that elk will utilize grasses much later than deer will. They can digest more mature grasses than deer can. One of the important things I wanted to talk about, though, was it often comes up in conversations I have, especially with the public, that people tend to use deer and elk abundance as a way of judging habitat quality. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the paper that Van Horn did back in the early 80s, but using animals and animal density can be a very problematic way of determining habitat quality. Habitat use could be just a seasonal use, could be a temporary use based on a previous year's attraction. Animals may be using a particular habitat because they're forced in there due to social interactions. Or it could be simply a result of survey methodology in that the animals aren't really being estimated as properly. And as far as I'm concerned, as far as my job goes, this is probably the primary reason why people can make that mistake. I have two good examples from where I work about this. Back in the early 90s, around the town of Siletz, there was a series of harvests, commercial timberland, of 40 to 50-year-old stands. Thousands of acres were harvested in a mosaic pattern. And before that time, we had seen very few deer and very little sign of deer in that particular stand forest. It had basically no understory. Really nothing for the deer to eat. Well, after thousands of acres of early Sierra forest habitat were created in just a few short years, we still saw very few deer. And many times we saw zero deer and zero use of deer in those clear cuts, essentially. It doesn't mean that the quality of those clear cuts was poor. In my opinion, they were. But the reason why we didn't see any deer was the fact that we didn't have a base population of deer to begin with to actually occupy the habitat. That was just a simple reason. It really had nothing to do with the habitat was given. Another example are during our elk releases in the Coast Range, especially Lincoln and Benton counties in the 70s, we released those elk into unoccupied habitat. Forest Service was still cutting a lot. They actually had some very high quality, in my opinion, early Sierra forest habitats for deer and elk. But the elk numbers expanded rapidly, and I don't think it had anything to do with the quality of the habitat. It had to do with that there were no elk to begin with, and that whatever food was there provided something, and the populations rapidly increased. Thanks to Joan, I can skip through this fairly rapidly, but There are a large number of other wildlife species that use early cirroforest habitats. Many of them have specialized needs. The list goes on, but there are at least 20 reptiles, dozens of mammals and birds. Even fish can indirectly benefit from early cirroforest habitats. The paper that Cheryl referred to this morning by Swanson is an excellent paper. If you haven't read it yet, I would suggest you do that. It does talk a little bit about fish in there too. I'm going to go through a few species here, and the point is to point out some of the differences that some of these species require compared to what I've just talked about with deer. Mountain bluebirds, for once, they occupy a variety of habitats, but mostly open habitat. They do nest in cavities. They basically feed on insects for the most part and berries. Physical structure of early cirroforest habitat, as Joan said, is very important to species like bluebirds. Hummingbirds, we kind of talked about them a little bit this morning. The calliope hummingbird is a good example, although this is not a picture of a calliope. This is a picture of an Allen's hummingbird. Calliopes prefer early cirroforests and open canopies. What they utilize, though, and what they look for is an abundance of flowering species of plants: currants, gooseberry, columbine, paintbrush, penstemon. Many of those plants would benefit deer as well. Bewick's wren, it's a common early cirroforest species here in western Oregon, but they're cavity nesters. So once again, they need that important vertical structure. They feed on insects and spiders. They don't occur in the arid desert regions, and they don't occur really in the deep, dense, moist forests in western Oregon. Mountain quail, which I didn't have a picture of, they are another species that benefits from early cirroforest habitats. They are in significant decline, especially in Intermountain West, the northern forests. And if I were to pick an indicator species to talk about, I think that, at least for eastern Oregon, I think mountain quail would be one that I would choose, certainly more so than mule deer, for instance. Reptiles like the western fence lizard, they're attracted to open habitats. Some species of lizards prefer arid, like the fence lizard. Some prefer humid conditions, such as the northern alligator lizard. Both these species actually occur in western Oregon. But you can tell that at least in the microclimate that they would select, they could be significantly different. Many snakes use early cirroforests. The rubber boa is one of interest, especially to us in western Oregon. They can be quite common in early cirroforest habitats as long as the area contains a lot of down logs, down woody debris that is especially in an advanced state of decay. Clouded salamanders, they're primarily a forest dweller, but they do occur in early cirroforest habitats that have large down logs. Joan talked about it. It's really a moisture thing that they're looking for. But they also eat ants and termites, which you'd expect to find in rotting and decaying wood. Other amphibians that I could mention are great basin spadefoot or the western toad. The western toad is more of a western Oregon species. It is also in decline. Both of these amphibians need water to breed, although spadefoots can use temporary sources of water. But in any case, these particular animals require probably more amount of water than many others. There's a wide variety of mammals that use early cirroforests, rodents, bats, carnivores, all sorts of things like that. The white-footed vole, this is not a picture of a white-footed vole, by the way, this is a deer mouse. The white-footed vole is one of those that appears to be, in a sense, an obligate to early cirroforests. And they are one of those critters that are actually probably benefiting from timber harvest. It is a very rare mammal, once found commonly. Shouldn't say that. Once found in this typical type of habitat here. This is what we see a lot of the coast. This is in a Sage National Forest, just a giant spruce tree, probably 10 feet in diameter, that blew over, which is very typical in the spruce hemlock zone near the coast of Oregon, creating this little gap. This is more typical of where you'd expect to find a white-footed vole. The white-footed vole is a leaf eater. It eats the leaves of shrubs, forbs, and also eats things like roots. The western harvest mouse, on the other hand, is a type of rodent that prefers grassy areas within early xeroforests, and it's primarily a seed eater. And basically, in summary, many birds, reptiles, mammals, amphibians, all have specialized needs that are not necessarily required by deer and elk. Black bears, I actually gave a talk at the last time we had the early xeroforest workshop, talk about big game use in early xeroforest, but I spent so much time working with black bears, and I know now that they can live anywhere, they can eat anything, so I don't want to talk about them. Basically, in summary, quality early xeroforests, especially for deer and elk, provides a diverse planted community that is high in digestible energy, protein, and is available year-round. It is also in a landscape that provides other habitats that provide cover from weather, predators, including people. Quality early xeroforest habitat for deer will provide benefits for a lot of other early xeroforest species. And I think if you looked at early xeroforest and thought that area should be full of deer, you probably would also think that other species would benefit from that as well. Conversely, early xeroforests that provide little benefit to deer, one with little plant diversity, such as an intensively managed post-disturbance plantation, it would have more than likely have very limited benefit to a wide variety of other wildlife species. And finally, because many early xeroforest species require additional physical structures and biotic attributes than deer and elk do, landscape management should not be specifically designed for deer or elk unless the goal is single species management. That's it. Questions, Cheryl? Well, I don't know about our native grasses. There's been a lot of studies on the nutritional quality and things of a wide variety of native grass species. I'm not so sure that's been done in Western Oregon. However, I think that in deer in particular, the focus should be more on browse, less on grass. But like I said, grass is an important component in the wintertime, especially in Western Oregon because of the climate, and you can often have non-dormant grass in the wintertime. But I think, as a general rule, native species are what these animals evolved with, and those are probably the ones that we should be using.